Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar series. If you have any questions during the presentation today, please type them into the question section as a GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the August 24th edition of Crop Talk. And on today's Crop Talk, we're going to have Dane Fraze on. He's our oilseed specialist, and Dane is going to give us an update on Clubroot in Manitoba and where we sit as a province and where we might be having some new finds, I guess, with the disease. And then also, any other new or issues that might be coming up with this year's canola crop, as Dane has been seeing over the past little while here. From that, we'll go into our crop scouting panel, and there's been a few questions coming in. I think we've been doing some, we've been doing some surveys lately for disease over the past 2 weeks, and I think as people have been out in the field, they've been seeing some different things happening, and I always thought some of those questions might come up as well in the crop scouting panel. So with that, I think we might just start with Dane, turn it over to Dane and get going with the canola update and the Clubroot update. So Dane, if you're ready, take it away.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me on, Lionel. Hope you can all hear me okay.
You bet, and we can see your screen.
Excellent. Okay. So you mentioned two things, looking and scouting for Clubroot and then a few canola updates. I won't focus on the canola updates so much, but I specifically wanted to address what to look for when you are out scouting this time of year as swathers start rolling, as you're starting to desiccate, or as harvest is progressing. Just looking for those odd spots and those diagnostic features of what would indicate Clubroot in the field. Sorry, just trying to advance here a little bit. There we go. Give you an overview of how Clubroot works for those that might be unfamiliar. If we start on the left-hand side under number 1, Clubroot is a soil-borne disease spawned by resting spores. So those are thick-walled, single-cell organisms that germinate under the right conditions, adequate temperature and moisture, just like most other diseases, and will swim a short distance to try and find a susceptible crop. Canola or any other brassica weed species would be a suitable host. Those will infect the root hairs initially, and as that pathogen develops, it develops into a secondary infection. So now we're on point number 3, and those root cells are corrupted. Instead of functioning like a normal root cell, uptaking water and nutrients, they act as a mini factory, just replicating and making more and more spores. And those spores, as they are replicated, swell up, and that gall forms, basically like a cancerous tumor, really stimulates cell division and growth, and that's what you get and that's how you get that Clubroot symptom. Pardon me. Those galls grow in size. I'm gonna back up a little bit here. Jumping on me. Galls grow in size, and if they are in the main tap root, it will affect the water and nutrient uptake for the plant, and that effectively chokes off yield, and that's how that yield infection or yield loss occurs. As that plant dies or that crop is then harvested, if it wasn't completely infected, that gall senesces and decomposes, and it becomes a very peat mossy type structure, and it just breaks off the soil. Every gall can produce billions of spores, and then those spores last in the soil up to 25, 30 years and can reinfect the following year.
Excuse me, Dane. It's Lori. Yeah. Sorry. Do you have a headset or anything that you could use for your audio other than your laptop audio?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Just make sure you speak very close to your laptop. Your audio is pretty poor today, so we'll just have to pay real close attention.
Okay. I'll try switching my microphone. Maybe that might make a difference. All right. Updates from this year. We have 3 new fields confirmed so far in 2022. We are now at over 45 fields that have a positive symptomatic case spread over 10 municipalities. That 10th municipality is in the process of confirming and updating our maps, so it's not something you're going to see yet, but do watch this space, and you might see it in the next month or so. Now, we do know that higher disease pressure is around this year, certainly, as a result of perfect, well, not quite perfect, but more favorable growing conditions for disease. We've had a warmer summer, we've had an abundance of moisture, and just like many other diseases, Clubroot likes those warm, moist conditions. So after 2 dry years where we didn't see much in terms of disease spread or development, we've certainly seen it come back and make a bit of a resurgence this year. Growers that might have thought or might have attributed a spot to be an area for excess water or moisture that had drowned out canola, but was previously well drained, are seeing that there's still, suffering plants in those locations, and that is one of those dead giveaways that there's something else going on. Now, the GIF on your screen shows the canola as a percentage of total acres in different municipalities from 2016 through 2019. Now, we know that an intense canola rotation is more common on the western side of the province, particularly in the parkland area, as well as the areas from Pembina through Prairie Lakes along the U.S. border. Just the nature of crop rotations in those areas, those are areas that are inherently higher risk, just simply because we are growing so much more canola. Lori, is my audio any better now?
Not really, no.
No, how about now?
Oh, that's very good. Thank you. Yes.
Good. Okay, there we go. Just had someone bring over a microphone for me.
Perfect.
This is our old map for Clubroot distribution in Manitoba. We have 9 municipalities colored red on here, meaning they are above 80,000 spores per gram of soil, or we see gall symptoms observed. So we don't have that 10th municipality colored on here just yet. But we are going to move to a map that looks more like this. This is the Harmonized Map in conjunction with what Saskatchewan and Alberta will be doing, or Saskatchewan is already doing, where we just show that we have scanned for Clubroot. Either Clubroot is detected, but not symptomatic, meaning that their spore load is not high enough to create those galls and thus that yield loss in canola. So that's that 1,000 to 80,000 spores per gram of soil. As soon as we start finding symptomatic fields, we color that RM yellow. If we reach over 10 fields within that RM turns orange. Our highest municipality is the RM of Pembina. We have 9 fields that we know of confirmed with Clubroot. There are very likely more. However, they have to be officially reported to us in order for us to update this map. So if you are calling in from an RM that is yellow or even blue, be very vigilant in your canola fields. Scout every field every year. I know it's a bit of slogging through some canola, but maybe that's what you hire an agronomist for. And do a very close examination of how that canola is doing in your field. And if you are in those yellow RMs, you should absolutely be using a Clubroot resistant variety on every acre every year that you grow canola. So scouting, looking for areas that are stressed or prematurely ripening compared to, say, other spots in the same field. And I'll have a few photos in a minute. You want to check these high-risk spots first. Your field approaches, so as machinery drives onto the field, most of us tend to be right-handed and most of us tend to turn to the right as we start field operations. So usually that's the first point where infected soil might fall off a cultivator or drill or some piece of machinery that was bringing an infected source from another point. Also check low spots. Clubroot likes warm temperatures and enough water to germinate. So those low spots and those bathtub rings around those low spots tend to be hot spots. Same with the water runs. Anywhere that moves soil through the landscape can spread Clubroot. Field corners, again, that jostling motion as machinery turns and may knock off soil. It could accumulate in those corners. And near old yards and shelter belts. Clubroot was first discovered on the prairies in the 1930s in vegetable gardens brought over from Europe, where seed and vegetables were brought over from the old country. So sometimes those vegetable gardens can become that infection point source. Shelter belts too also act as a wind stop, can stop soil erosion and can lead to soil depositing near the base of those shelter belts. Could be another point to consider. So in those spots, you're wanting to dig up, not just pull plants, because by pulling plants, sometimes they break off at the base. And if they are breaking off at the soil line level, that's almost a dead giveaway that there's something wrong happening underneath the soil, and you need to dig up to extract that root to really examine the connection point and see if that root is in fact healthy or damaged. Clubroot development, again, favored by warm, moist soils and soils that have a lower pH. So a higher pH doesn't necessarily prevent clubroot, but it certainly slows the spread, and it seems to reduce the severity of infection. So these pictures were taken from a field just this summer, actually 2 weeks ago. Have an aerial overhead. We've got a field corner in this case with patchy symptoms and ring symptoms. So we're seeing here canola. It's actually still blooming a little bit in the corner on this drone shot. A drowned out spot here, but it's dead in the middle and then healthy right up to the edge. So on this one in my overhead shot is not as much of a concern as the image right in the middle of the screen, where you see a dead patch in the middle, followed by yellowed, prematurely ripening canola, stunted canola, around the bathtub ring of that patch. And then you can kind of see it move in other parts of the field where it's a little bit yellow to the left and a little bit yellow on the streaks to the right. As soon as you're seeing linear lines in the field, dead giveaway that there's machinery action involved. So these would be stripe marks drawn by the drill or the cultivator or whatever it was that was seeding this field that's moved clubroot through the landscape and now infected down that line where soil has been moved. So on the right-hand side, we see the ground level shot of that premature ripening. Still good pod development, so obviously infection wasn't extremely severe, but severe enough that there's absolutely yield loss compared to the green canola in the background. Another shot of that same field. So low areas are prime clubroot hotspot areas and need to be investigated. So that patch I was talking about the previous slide is on the very left-hand side of the screen, close to the bush line there. But there's a couple other points that would be worth considering in this field. I mean, prairie pothole country does have quite varied landscape, and sometimes an aerial shot is the best way of looking at this, that you're able to see it ahead of time or ahead of when the swather or the sprayer would be in the field. So we've got this yellow line kind of running at a slight angle, almost through the middle of the screen. Likely a water run there or something that moves water through the landscape that has clubroot developing on it. So it's running perpendicular to the cedar pass lines. So I'm thinking it's not a mechanically moved infection at this point, but we're seeing it distributed to the landscape. So I'm assuming that's a water run. The red circle there shows that initial infection point that we studied, but I didn't have time to troop through the canola field with the producer in this case, but want to encourage them to go back and do some more investigating. So on my follow-up investigations, I would be investigating all of these blue circle points. Check that corner a little more closely. Anywhere in these areas where I'm seeing pockets of prematurely ripening canola, as well as that water run line. Follow that trace mark through the field. And if I'm sampling in those locations, I want to take soil samples from those locations just to do a spore count. I don't want to sample from the rest of the field, where the field is relatively healthy, but I want to aggregate my samples only from the points of concern. By aggregating it from other areas that are not of concern, you can tend to mask the effect of how many clubroot spores might be in a gram of soil and artificially lower that number. Now, a little closer up imagery, I mentioned that machinery drag can move infected soil through a field. On the left-hand side, we're seeing that prematurely ripening strip. It's directly in a drag track line, and those canola plants were all galled and fairly severely galled. On the right-hand side, we're seeing the edge of that patch where canola was prematurely ripening. Certainly lower yield in that patch. Clubroot yield can reduce, clubroot galls can reduce canola yield anywhere from 5 to 95%. This infected patch compared to the rest of the field would have probably a 50% yield hit to it. Now, the gall development in this patch was quite severe, leading me to believe that there had been fairly severe clubroot infection in years past that had probably gone unnoticed or was attributed to excess moisture drowning out, that sort of thing. But now it's very clearly seen in the patch as well as streaking through the field. So this field has certainly had clubroot infection for many years and just hadn't been caught until this point. Certainly things to consider. If clubroot is starting to develop It's absolutely a case of it must be managed well now and not delayed and kicked down into the future. Another image from the Arborg area from 2019, actually. We had a producer call about clubroot galls, and on this particular field had a fair bit of peat moss underneath. So it's a very acidic type soil. So the severity of gall development was much higher, and it developed more rapidly in this case. So here we can see green canola on the headland and green canola kind of through a patch on the right. That was considered the healthy canola in this field. The rest of the field basically had clubroot, where we see it browning and prematurely ripening in those other locations. Gall development wasn't a death toll to this particular canola crop. Infection was about a 50% severity, meaning that the canola obviously did survive enough to produce some yield, but it was certainly less in the green canola than we saw here in the healthy patches. Now, when you're looking at the roots below ground, the plant on the left, I would give that a 2 rating. So clubroot is rated from a 0 to 3 scale. 0 meaning none, obviously, 3 meaning completely galled up and completely blocking off the main taproot. So we're seeing some galls on this edge of the main taproot, but primarily on the lateral roots. So in that case, it's certainly leading to a fairly severe infection and severe yield loss, but the plant isn't completely toast just yet. So that would be a 2. That's what we're looking for, those swollen, carrot-like, firm, textured roots that we would see generally from the beginning of July through middle of August. As canola starts to senesce and ripen, the galls die off as well, and we tend to see them look more like they do on the right, where those galls decompose and it becomes a very fluffy, peat mossy type structure. If you pull those out and you let them sit in your office or the back of a truck for even a couple minutes, the whole thing smells like rotting cabbage. So it's a dead giveaway too that smell is pervasive. So early gall development on the left, again, this would be a 1 on a clubroot scale, where we see a single gall forming on the edge of the lateral root. It starts on those root hair infections. We move to a whole gall. Again, here we've got a massive tumor at the base of the primary taproot. That would be a rated 3. And on the right, we're seeing those galls and rip off. Really, especially if the soil is fairly moist and mellow. If you're pulling them out of the ground, you tend to tear off the roots, and that's why I always say dig them out, so you get a closer look at the symptoms developing on the base of the plant. And I mentioned spore load and spore load numbers because based on greenhouse studies, we know that clubroot infection tends to be most severe and most yield damaging when we cross that 80 to 100,000 spore per gram of soil mark. So that's the second canola root from the right. And at that point, we're seeing yield loss above ground. We're seeing plant symptoms above ground where they're dying off and ripening prematurely. Lower than that point, it's hard to tell, above ground anyway, that there's something happening, something damaging happening below the surface. So once we cross that point, that's when we tend to see those symptomatic fields, and we need to have management now. Obviously, management now on the other side of the scale is certainly needed too. But we do have more time in those cases, and that's why we really encourage soil testing, just to examine how many spores per gram of soil we have in our fields, and we're able to take proactive management and more progressive steps as the infection becomes more severe. The earlier on you catch that infection, the earlier on it can be treated, and you can manage it better long term. On the right-hand side, it tends to be more chronic, and reactions and management thus has to be more severe. Now, I want to encourage soil testing, and I mentioned that just a second ago. The Manitoba canola growers run a lab called the Pest Surveillance Initiative in Winnipeg that is funded with grower checkoff dollars, and up until last year was also co-funded by government, where farmers that paid their checkoff and didn't ask for a refund were entitled to free tests for clubroot, for blackleg, glyphosate-resistant kochia, and verticillium. So focusing specifically on the clubroot here, I wanted to encourage growers to be able to take advantage of those free tests, send in soil samples, and examine what the spore load is in the soil. I have 2 screen grab videos here that I wanted to walk you through just to show you how to go about claiming those free tests. So the first video on your left, you're going to want to go to canolagrowers.com. Nice, easy website to remember. That will bring you to the MCGA webpage, where they'll give you the instructions on how to claim your Clubroot codes. So go down to research, you're going to want to pick PSI Lab or the Get Tested program. Scroll down a little bit. This is on mobile on your computer. It's a little easier. It gives you the steps and the hyperlinks for the sampling guidelines that are developed by the 3 prairie provinces. Check the consent boxes and email gettested@canolagrowers.com. That's the email address you need to contact with your name and address information. They will email you a code that you use on the PSI website. Pardon me. On the PSI website, mbpestlab.ca, you're going to go through that webpage there. So it gives you a note on MCGA members being allowed to test for free. You're going to pick that Clubroot test, otherwise $125 value. Enter your RM, enter your legal land description. Both of those are needed in order to develop the maps that we use. We cannot share specific grower names, addresses, contact information, or specific legal land descriptions, but we do use it to aggregate and identify by township. So when custom work crews, oil rigs, Manitoba Hydro, etc., is moving through the landscape on utilities, they do ask us for the Clubroot risk for certain municipalities or certain townships, and we're able to say, yes, this is a high risk area. Absolutely, you need to be using good biosecurity and sanitation, or no, this is a lower risk spot. Use appropriate measures. So you're going to apply your code here, update your cart, proceed to checkout. You can add additional tests at that time. You need about 3 to 4 cups of soil right off the soil surface. So you're not using the same amount of soil that you would from a soil test, where you're taking multiple points throughout the field. Like I mentioned, you don't want to aggregate soil in this case. You want to take it only from those high risk areas and just from the soil rooting zone. So down to about 3-4 inches. Scrape away the residue from the surface. Just take a scoop right off the surface and put that into a little sample bag and send that in. That's really all you need. You could aggregate the soil from other high risk areas into a collectivized sample, but sometimes it's better to manage different patches if your risk is different. So when you get the lab result, they will give you a scale that looks sort of like this. Either Clubroot is not detected, or it is detected, and then they will do a count of the spores per gram of soil. And this particular lab example came back with 3,328, so still well below that 80,000 spore mark. But this lab result tells me that my soil tested positive for Clubroot. The DNA is present. There are spores that could infect and could blow up in future. So this would tell me that I need to start implementing a Clubroot management plan on my farm. I need to lengthen my rotation, certainly, have at least 2 years between successive canola crops, and I need to start using Clubroot resistant hybrids on every acre, not just on the field that tested, but on every acre, because we know we use that same machinery going from one field to the next, to the next, to the next. It can easily move around my own farm or across the road, those sorts of things. So using Clubroot resistant varieties as a proactive preventative maintenance strategies is very good, as well as cleaning off equipment as best you can. The hyperlinks on those websites will give you the guide to how to take representative soil samples. I mentioned this a couple times already. Sample your high risk areas. Don't aggregate the sample from an entire field as you would with nutrient testing. You just want it from those high risk spots. Collect the samples in the fall or the spring. It doesn't really matter what time of year you do it. However, spore load changes and fluctuates throughout the year. Spore load is highest typically in October, November, after those galls have decomposed and released back into the soil. And they tend to be lowest in about June, early July, when those spores that were overwintering have now migrated and moved into canola roots, trying to find a new home to reproduce. So then they move out of the soil and into the roots. And then your soil sample tends to be a little lower. If you test year over year, it's a good idea to just try and test about the same time each year. So not doing spring one year, fall the next, because then your numbers tend to be a bit skewed. Now, how to manage Clubroot spores. This is messaging that comes from the Canola Council of Canada. We want to keep them low. Use a crop rotation with a minimum 2-year breaks between canola crops, so we're not allowing those spores to reproduce and blow up. You want to scout every canola field every year. You can't manage what you don't know is there, and that's really what I want growers to focus on is understanding why weird patches in the field look the way they do and what might be causing it. Growing Clubroot resistant hybrids. Resistance should be deployed on all acres if the risk is present. Now, the risk in the Red River Valley, for example, might be a little lower than other parts of the province just due to a longer rotation, heavier soils, higher pH. Doesn't mean it couldn't develop here, but it tends to be a lower risk versus, say, if you were in the arm of Lorne or if you were south of Riding Mountain National Park, where there is a lot of canola growth every year. Control those host weeds so you don't have that green bridge. Volunteer canola, wild mustard, flaxweed, shepherd's purse, and stinkweed. If you have a clubroot patch and it's not spread through the rest of the field yet, patch management is a great tool. Seed that area down to grass, hay it off, use lime, something that prevents mechanical tillage traffic and implement traffic through that field, prevent soil from moving off site and water and wind from moving it off site too. So that does really help and allows those spores several years to drop down just due to natural death in those patches. The other side, this is my GIF here. This is what I want you to do with clubroot. Keep it low, keep banging it down. And local, making sure those spores stay on that site and they don't move off site. So sanitation, that's where we try and clean off our machinery, clean off the tractor tires, try and stay out of the field when it's really, really muddy or mucky, because that brings more clods off the field, right? If it's dry, the risk is relatively quite low for moving soil out. Patch management, again, knowing those clubroot hotspot zones and treating them like separate areas within the field. If it's only 1 or 2 acres in the field, it's well worth your time to seed that down to a grass and not run seeder through it every year and risk spreading it around like we saw those machine drag tracks in those previous photos. And then reducing tillage. So minimize soil movement within and between fields wherever you can. Now, that's all I had for clubroot identification. If you have any questions or if you see anything of concern, I'd love to hear about it. Manitoba does not regulate clubroot like it is done in Saskatchewan and Alberta, meaning there is no penalty or no bylaw or anything that can be imposed upon the farmer if clubroot is discovered. But absolutely, we still want to hear about it because this allows us to keep our map up to date, make sure extension goes to the right places. We're, letting retailers know that, hey, clubroot is in the area, making sure their custom app machinery is cleaned up as best they can, making sure they are using or marketing clubroot resistant hybrids, and making sure that, the neighbors know, not that we rat out the farmer to the neighbors, but it's to say, hey, clubroot is in the area. It's not an individual farmer's concern per se, it's an entire community's thing, just like glyphosate resistant kochia, right? It doesn't stay on one person's field, it rolls from one field to the next to the next. Same with clubroot. I mean, it's anything that moves soil, wind, water, livestock, machinery, wildlife can move those clubroot spores. So once it's in an area, it's certainly a whole community thing that you want to get behind and keep on top of. So making sure that those extension materials and training goes to the right place. So it's always helpful to have more information rather than less. So if you see any of that, by all means, give me a call, send me an email. I'd be happy to help and happy to come up with a management plan for your own farm. And with that, Lionel, did you have questions specific to the canola production in Manitoba this year?
Well, I will, but maybe what I can do is I can maybe save them to the crop scouting panel, and I can get you to maybe answer them there. I got some questions that came in about clubroot that I'd like you to address. So, are there any other diseases similar to clubroot or can be confused with clubroot right now?
Not really. It's pretty rare. If you're seeing, plants that are prematurely ripening or dying off, obviously check above ground too. I mean, there might be root maggots, it might be blackleg that's causing, canola to die. It could be hail, excessive grasshopper feeding, those sorts of things. But clubroot is one of the only ones that happens below ground where you see the galls on the plant roots, which is why the above ground symptomology is your trigger to start looking below ground. If you can't rule out something that's happening above ground, you go below ground and you pull up that plant root and look at it that way. When I'm in the field, that's always the first thing I try and rule out. It's easy enough to pull up the plant, just look at the base. If there's nothing happening below ground, then I start working on above ground symptomology. Maybe it's a foliar disease. But those galls forming on the roots is a dead giveaway.
Okay. The next question is, you showed a slide there where the movement in the field, and the question came up as to how far can it move in an individual year?
Oh, That's a good question. I'll just throw that picture back up.
Actually, Lori, okay, go ahead, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah, it depends on your tillage practices and your landscape practices. Um, the clubroot spores themselves don't swim particularly far. If a spore is present, in 1 square foot of soil and it germinates under the right moisture and heat conditions, if the field isn't, overland flooding, that spore might only move, a foot, foot and a half, searching for a susceptible plant to infect. Now, when we add mechanical tillage or rapid overland flow of water, um, we can move it way further. If any of your listeners were at Crop Diagnostic School 3 years ago, the last year I think it was pre-COVID, we did a demonstration where we demonstrated a couple different types of tillage practice. Marla Rickman and John Hurd were doing it, where on a side hill slope they seeded a trench of corn and then they ran through it with a high-speed vertical till implement, a moldboard plow, chisel type cultivator, double discs, that sort of thing. Now, a high-speed tillage implement moves the least amount of soil, but it moved it the furthest. I believe it moved it 15 or 16 feet from the initial point. So say we treat those corn kernels as clubroot spores. If you're running through it with a high-speed vertical till implement at 12 miles an hour, you could be moving those soil particles 10, 15 feet in a year. And that is now the new seed, quote unquote seed, for the clubroot infection next year. You run through it again twice, now it's 30 feet. You can move a lot of soil, but a shorter distance if you're using a chisel plow cultivator or a double disc. They still move at a distance. The best practice is to not till it at all and go with zero till or to grass down that area to prevent you from wanting to till through it until spores have a chance to die off naturally. So the clubroot itself doesn't move very far, but what we do to it moves it further.
okay. How long will the gall last in the fall? I guess the comment was made that as harvesting is going, can you mark spots in the field that you, I guess, as they're harvesting the crop, they can mark the spots and then go back later on to those spots and grab samples.
Yes, that's right, for sure. If you're able to mark it on your GPS, a spot of concern or throw a flag out the combine or however you want to do it, the galls will last. They'll be firm galls while the crop is still green. And if the infection wasn't severe enough to cause that massive premature ripening, as I showed in some photos, um, it should hang on, middle of September-ish. After that point, we tend to see those peaty galls, and they tend to break off. And if you were to pull them up, you'd see the top of the plant break off from the root at the base. Now that still happens in severe infection and later on to the year, like right into November. If it wasn't infected, despite it being late November, you should still be able to pull up the stubble and the root connected. But if the root and the stubble disconnect and they break off that point in time, that's a good indication too that was your hotspot, because those peat moss type galls have broken off and decayed. So that's still your identifying symptom later on.
Okay, how many free tests is a producer allowed?
I believe it is an unlimited number, but I would have to check with MCGA on that one. I know they initially started with just one per grower per type per year, but I believe they've kind of opened it up and they said, send as many as you want in right now to take advantage of that lab service. And I should add, growers or agronomists can submit on behalf of their growers as well. They just need to go through that same claim process, and they'll need their growers' farm name and contact information in order to use their checkoff dollar credit against the lab testing.
Okay, and this question comes from me. You showed the one, or you mentioned that Clubroot has been around for a long time, and will not most of the fields in Manitoba or the prairies show a positive for
No,
Clubroot?
actually. Most fields are still showing, or at least in Manitoba, are still testing negative. Either the spore loads are really, really low to a point, or they're not able to infect, or we're not testing the right spots within the field. And I lean on that last one fairly heavily. We know that I could go up into the parkland area, pick a spot of healthy canola, and I'm not going to find it, or I'm going to get a negative test, meaning no data, or it's showing that clubroot isn't present, even though if I walked 400 yards down into the curve or the low spot of the field, I could have a spore count that reaches well over 1 million. Clubroot is certainly tends to restrict itself to those favorable growing environments, those low areas, bathtub ring type effects, those corners. So it can be a really important factor to test in those high risk areas only, and exclusively test those areas, not just randomly sampling in the healthy part of the field, because that isn't going to tell you what you're looking for. Not that you want to have a positive result, but if you're going to look for it, you're going to try and look for a spot that's most likely to have that disease develop. So we do see fields where there's really high areas, there's areas where there's zero, and then there's fields that have no history of clubroot and haven't been exposed to the risk. And as growers are able to grow more and more clubroot resistant canola, that risk becomes lower, because that canola plant doesn't act as a green bridge and doesn't allow nearly as much infection, and doesn't allow those spores to replicate and reproduce.
Okay, that's some really good information, Dane. And like I mentioned, if you're going to hang on for the panel, there'll be a couple more questions, at least one more question for you as we get into the crop scouting panel. So thanks for that information today on clubroot. Good information, and I think timely, because we're just starting to see some spraying and maybe the odd field starting to be swathed. So I think as producers get out in the field, they'll be seeing more and more things happening out there. So thanks again for doing that. Okay, I'm gonna just do a little brief update as to, I guess, as harvest has started in Manitoba here, as to where we kind of sit, and then we'll get into our crop scouting panel. When you look at percentage of harvest completed, basically we're talking winter wheat and fall rye through most of the province. There has been the odds field of spring wheat done. I noticed in some of my travels that in some of the lighter areas, lighter soil areas, south of rivers, I noticed some wheat being harvested, and just in some of the areas where I guess moisture is more the critical growing factor. Some of these crops matured a little bit quicker, or were able to be planted earlier in the spring and got a normal growing season as we get into the end of August, and are kind of coming off at the right time period. Some oats crops have been starting to be harvested, I've seen, and the odd field of peas is starting to come off. So you look at the numbers, we're fairly low besides the winter seeded crops, and as we go so far. Fall rye yields kind of all over the board, and I think that's pretty normal for fall rye throughout the province. Sometimes you get good growing conditions for some areas, and fall rye just goes like crazy. And other times, if you're missing moisture at a certain time, the crop just doesn't seem to do as well. But averages, anywhere between that 75 and 90, which is really good for fall rye. Lots of straw. That's one of the comments I'm getting from a lot of producers, is that there's a lot of straw, and a lot of producers are looking at swathing it to help it dry down a little bit faster. Rainfall we've been getting lately probably isn't helping a lot with the guys that did put it in the swath. Seeing the rain we got last night through most of the southwest here was fairly large, anywhere from half to 1.5 inches, to some places reporting up to 3 inches. And I think there was some thunder showers and hailstorms that went through as well. A lot of wind too in some of those cases. So it definitely is going to create some issues with anything that was in a swath right now. And we did see a fair bit of lodging in some of the crop that's still out there. Winter wheat harvest, again, not getting a lot of reports of winter wheat being harvested. A lot of it's been sprayed. Some has been harvested, and yield ranges vary again quite a bit. We had some winter wheat that had winter kill this year and just didn't get off to a good enough start, and then some weed issues came in, so some of those are reporting a little bit lower yields, but you know, anywhere averaging probably anywhere in that 60 bushel range, and I think that average is probably going to come up here as we get some of these some later of the winter wheat harvest come in. Some of those crops did look fairly good, so I think we might see that that yield jump a little bit. Quality variable, but I think from talking to the guys that are doing some harvest, most of it's coming off as a 2, and protein levels anywhere between 10 and 13%. So we are seeing some fusarium, but levels right now are low, and which is good. And I think as we go into the wheat harvest, we'll probably be seeing some of the same. And speaking of some of the wheat that's been coming off, most of it has been happening on the eastern side of the province, and proteins again ranging from 12 to 14% protein. We're again seeing some kernels showing damage from fusarium, but the DON levels so far are fairly low, and I think we'll be talking a little bit about fusarium as we get into the crop scouting panel as well. So just a bit of an update as to how harvest has been going throughout the province so far. So basically the winter cereals and some of the early planted spring cereals, and some oats, and maybe the odd field of peas is starting to come off as well. So with that, we'll jump into our crop scouting panel, and as I mentioned, that we're into that time where harvest is getting really close, and a lot of guys are looking at doing some pre-harvest applications to spring wheat. The question has come up a lot of times about the proper timing for spraying, especially spring wheat right now, and I thought it would be a good question to be addressed by, I'm going to open this one up to Ann Kirk, our cereal specialist, and also Kim Brown. If you're on, you can chime in as well and as to what some of your thoughts as well. So if you two want to take a stab at this one.
Sure, thanks, Lionel. So for spring wheat, or any cereal crop really, if you're looking at pre-harvest glyphosate for perennial weed control or another product for desiccation, it can be a bit challenging if the growth stage is variable. So you want to be looking at the least mature area of the field when you're making a decision on when you should spray. So we shouldn't be applying any pre-harvest products if the grain moisture content is above 30%. So realistically, that looks like the best way to tell that is doing the thumbnail test. So, peeling, like threshing out some heads, sticking your thumbnail into the kernel. If it's firm and a thumbnail impression remains on the kernel, then the field is likely at the correct stage. If the kernel is a bit softer and you push your thumbnail in and it slowly disappears and pops back, then that would still be considered the soft dough stage and too early for a pre-harvest application. So if we do apply products too early, you can see both a kernel weight or a yield reduction. So kernel weight, just because the kernels haven't actually finished filling out and gaining all of the weight prior to the hard dough stage. And then a yield reduction. And also you could be at an issue being above the maximum residue limits for that product applied, since more of the product would be staying on the kernel if applied too early. So swath timing is quite similar for wheat, barley, and oats. So if you are considering swathing, that hard dough stage is the ideal time, or that about 30% kernel moisture is the ideal time for swathing as well.
It's Kim here. I would just echo everything that Ann has said. What I find is that when you're staging your wheat, or you're looking to put that pre-harvest glyphosate on, if you think it's a bit early, it is. You always want to go on the later side. Like if you think it's just a touch green, but I'm going to do it anyways, that's always a bad idea. You really need to realize that staging is usually later than you think it is. We just have too many times it goes on a little bit too green. You really have to get that on late. We are not doing that for dry down. We are doing the pre-harvest glyphosate for weed control, and so it's going to be slower. If you actually want dry down, then you have to start looking at that's not the product to be using if you want a quick dry down. So that's, something else we can talk about. But yeah, with glyphosate, you need to get that on. It's almost always later than you think it should be. If you think it's time to go, but it's maybe a touch early, then please wait. Like, give yourself another few days, depending on the weather. We want that on later. It's got to be under that 30% moisture.
Okay.
Just one other comment for that is, like I did mention that, you should be looking at the latest part of the field, but also when you're looking at heads, like, it's pretty easy just to pull a few kernels from the middle of a head, but it's good to remember that the middle matures first. So when you're looking at a spike of wheat, the middle part of the spike flowers first and then will therefore mature first. So it's good to look on the top and bottom to see what those kernels look like and base it off of the least mature part of the field and the least mature kernels in the spike.
Okay, and just one kind of a second part to the question. I've always heard people talk about when you look at the stem of the plant just below the head, what it should look like as well. Any comments is that?
Yeah, so the peduncle is the part of the stem just below the head. And you do see that as the plant reaches physiological maturity, that section of the stem will start to darken. That is a good indication of when we're getting close to physiological maturity, but the best indication is actually threshing out some heads and using the thumbnail test. And also, the color of the peduncle does change a bit from variety to variety, so I think the best indication is to look at the seeds.
Okay, great. So it's a help, but it's the best is definitely checking the seed.
Yes.
Great, thanks, guys. Next question for John Gavloski. Preparing your bin storage this fall, bugs we should watch for and some things we should be looking for use for control.
So yeah, first of all, the two stored grain insects here that you should be most concerned about are rusty grain beetle, which is the one you see on the top right, and foreign grain beetle on the lower right. The biggest things you can do right now: clean any old grain out of bins before new grain goes in. And that it goes not just for bins, but for combines, grain wagons, augers, any grain that has been sitting for a substantial period in any of that farm equipment can get a population started, and then that would go in with your grain. So just clean things out the best you can. Be careful what you put into a bin, though. Some chemicals, such as malathion, can't be used with certain commodities, such as oil seeds, so do check on that. And if by chance you do have a problem, it is good to sort out which of these two is the culprit. Foreign grain beetle is a mold feeder mainly, so usually when we get that one in the bin, it's because there is some mold in the bin. So getting things dried out is what you need to do. Rusty grain beetle will feed on drier grain, so that's a bit of a bigger issue. The other thing that you can do once the grain is in the bin, get the temperature of the core temperature of the grain down below 15 degrees as quickly as you can. So that might mean running the aeration if you have it in the evenings. Once you get the core temperature down below 15 degrees, the stored grain insects won't be reproducing in your grain. So that can really help as well.
Okay, and so the biggest issue is, talk to a lot of producers when they go to check the top of the bin later on and they got crusting forming. So is that because all the moisture just migrated to the top and then the bugs started working in those areas?
That's often what happens. You're right. The moisture is moving up and settling on those upper layers. You get that crust, and that's often where you will find the insect populations.
Okay, good. Thanks, Sean. Okay, I'm going to open this one, I guess, up to Dave Kaminsky. We're doing a lot of disease surveys right now, and we've been doing a lot of wheat surveys for Fusarium. And one question I got is, can infection continue to spread through the head as harvest is delayed from wet conditions?
Okay, excuse me. Well, it's good that you put up that image on the right-hand side, because it shows, pardon me, the orange incrustation of the asexual type of spores that Fusarium produces. Those are splashed to adjacent heads by the action of rainfall. They're not just released by the action of wind, etc. And potentially there can be infection of later emerging tillers. But after flowering has completed on a head, there will not generally be new infection. I guess if the disease is severe enough and in the middle to upper portion of the head, you'll probably see top death of the head and grain that really never develops in that part of the head. So that might be a yield loss more than a quality loss. But generally, what you see is what you get when you're doing your evaluation at 10 days to 2 weeks after T3 timing, when you might have applied a fungicide. That's what's going to be harvested. And you can open those spikelets, open the glooms, and have a look at the grain that has developed inside. Sometimes it's so severely affected that it's likely to blow out the back of the combine with the chaff. But if they are full-size kernels, which are chalky white on the outside, then that's likely to end up in the hopper and be counted as Fusarium damaged kernels. I think that's enough said for now.
Okay, and just another part of question, I guess. Okay, so the Fusarium is not going to spread. What about the dawn level on the kernel that is infected? The longer it stays out, will it get worse, or does it just get to a certain point where it's shriveled up and is gone?
It's a fair question, a good question, Lyle, but I'm not sure that I can answer that. Again, the dawn level depends on how much of the grain is actually harvested. And yeah, I think we need to talk to experts with the Canadian Grain Commission for that kind of thing. It's too bad that Randy Clear, my ecologist, is retired now, because he's the one who might have had the best handle on this. Another thing, Lionel, about that image that you show in the inset on the right is that there's some black discoloration, both on the glooms and on the awns. That's not further manifestation of the Fusarium fungus. It is surface growth of what are called the sooty molds. And they are things like Alternaria and Cladosporium, which are not aggressive pathogens. They're saprophytes. They simply grow on already dead tissue. So that's another thing that can be eye-catching when you're out in the field.
Okay, good. Thanks for pointing that out, Dave.
Yep.
Okay, sticking with disease surveys and updates, I'm going to open this one up to Dane and to Dave. Been getting a couple calls from producers about sclerotinia and maybe a little concern as to levels being a little bit higher this year. And I just wanted to know, with from you guys doing your surveys, have you seen, or what are your kind of what have you guys seen so far this year, and what you've been seeing and talking to your producers?
Hey Lionel, Dane here. I've only actually been to 1 or 2 fields so far. I still need to get to a bunch of them yet. But what I am noticing is, yeah, sclerotinia is popping up more frequently. And in fact, I actually had trouble identifying it because I hadn't seen it in the field at all for the previous 3 years. So that was a bit of a relearning experience. seeing some verticillium on stems as stems degrade and some of the riper patches of the field. However, that is such a late season disease, you don't see it developed very well right now, and it can be hard to identify on green canola. That tends to be a swath timing or later type of effect for the most part. David, what have you seen in terms of blackleg development? I found it similar to previous years.
Yeah, Dean, blackleg development is similar to previous years in that we're finding it. I've seen incidents up to maybe, even 20%, but when you cut open those stems, it's only a small wedge of the stem that's affected, something that we would rate as a 1. I've rarely seen anything more than that.
Yeah, I was going to add that too. Sorry, it seems like it's less severe, perhaps, than it maybe it was last year.
Maybe, yeah. You know, at times it's considered a wilt pathogen because it affects the plant by cutting off the vascular or water conducting tissues. So we haven't had so much of those stressful conditions from dry heat getting close to swathing time. And that may be part of the reason. I don't know. So back to Sclerotinia, Lionel. I was allocated 14 fields to survey, and as of yesterday, I finished 7 of those. Only 2 of them north of the park, the rest south in the southwest quadrant. And I've seen 2 fields where I've got percentage infection 15 to 18% range. And both of those fields were unsprayed, was the grower's choice. And they realized that there will be yield loss, and it probably would have been offset by the cost of fungicide and application, especially with commodity price being fairly strong right now. But, you know, I think we're back to the way we normally approach the Sclerotinia problem in Manitoba. We know that if there's risk, we have to use fungicides prior to symptom development, and most people are taking that prophylactic approach. You can see wheel tracks in most fields, and often when you don't see them, talking to producers, you find that they have been sprayed aerially.
Hey, good. Yeah, no, that's something I've been seeing, and again, I haven't done all of them yet, but just from that and talking to a few producers, Sclerotinia is a little bit easier to find this year, that's for sure. Okay, so that's the questions I had for the panel this week. I wanted to just give some information slides here. There's introduction to the Prairie Watershed Climate Program that's available for in Manitoba here. It's actually happening on August the 25th. You need to pre-register for this, so if you want to get more information, you need to go to just go to on Google and type in a Prairie Watershed Climate, and it takes you to the registration. It's mandatory. It's going to be done by webinar, and so if you're interested in this, I think it's something that's going to be happening more and more as we get into different programs. So I don't know if there's anybody on the panel that might want to comment about this. I don't know a lot about this program. I just seen it, and it just the date for it was coming up really fast here, so I just thought I'd put it on today. Okay, I put this up last week, but I'm going to keep putting it up because I think it's some important dates to remember. October 24th to the 28th in Manitoba here. If you've got unwanted chemical or livestock medications that you want to get rid of, there'll be several locations throughout the province will be having drop-off days. So make sure you take advantage of this. The hay listing program, there's a really good crop of hay this year. So if anybody's interested in selling some of it, you can definitely put your information on that. we're that time of year where the crop residue burning is in place. So if you're looking at doing any burning of fields this fall, make sure you're checking the crop residue burning authorization to make sure it's a burn day. I mentioned this last few slides, our last few webinars. We're having the kind of get to know our website days, and it'll be happening in November here. And just an update, the phone number for Aaron is I had put it on there wrong before, so that's the right phone number there now. The crop extension specialists in Manitoba. So if you've got any questions as we get into harvest and want to talk to some of the extension specialists, as our contact information. I'd also like to welcome Veronica. She's going to be our new crop extension specialist in Gimli, and has started. So that's good to add another extension specialist to the crew. Our livestock extension people, as we get into putting up a lot more feed this year, and maybe I've seen a few guys talking about different crops that they had put in for silage. If you want information as to feeding some of the feed that we got this year, definitely people to contact. Our MASC service centers, there's the numbers for all the different service centers across the province. And if you got questions, there's mine and Lori's email addresses as well. Join us next week, August 31st, and I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about harvested crop and what some of that crop has looked like. Hopefully the weather smartens up and we get some good harvesting weather. And thanks for attending, and see you next week.